Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share some thoughts on Molloy by Samuel Beckett, which is the first in his trilogy of novels published in the early 1950s. It was followed by Malone Dies in the Unnameable. And it's a fascinating, though outright challenging book. If we were to regard literary modernism as sort of its own ecosystem within the various styles, genres, traditions of the novel, we said literary modernism is its own ecosystem. In my reading, Molloy could very well be the apex predator. It is a very dense work. It is unconventional in terms of the style, in terms of various characterizations, in terms of the absence of what we often regard as certain hallmarks of the novel. Yes, there are characters. Molloy is divided into two parts. Each is narrated very unreliably by a first person. The first part is narrated by Molloy, the second by Jacques Moran, Sergeant Jacques Moran, who's supposed to be searching for Molloy. And within this, there begins to be this mystery that occurs across the books. But it's also can be a very funny book. It can be. I think there's a reading of it that veers more towards the comedy side of tragic comedy, and there's a reading of it that veers more towards the tragedy side of the tragic comedy. For example, within the first portion, there's this long discursus about how Molloy wants to get this zinger and say something at just the right time. And so he's going on and on about this. That's why it was important to deliver it at the right moment and in the right tone. I apologize for these details. In a moment we'll go faster, much faster, and then perhaps relapse again into a wealth of filthy circumstance, but which in its turn again will give way to vast frescoes dashed off with loathing. And so there's this spiteful humor that is running through the narration, but it can feel very challenging. As I said, the book really starts off with a series of these strange questions that we never clearly get an answer for. I am in my mother's room, and it's I who live there now. I don't know how I got there. Perhaps in an ambulance, certainly a vehicle of some kind. I was helped. I'd never have got there alone. There's this man who comes every week. Perhaps I got here thanks to him. He says not. He gives me money and takes away the pages. So many pages, so much money. Yes, I work now a little like I used to, except that I don't know how to work anymore. That doesn't matter, apparently. What I'd like now is to speak of the things that are left, say my goodbyes, finish dying. They don't want that. Yes, there is more than one apparently, but it's always the same one that comes. And so right off the bat, we have those questions. Our narrator doesn't know how he's in this room. It seems to be familiar. We're not told his name right away. He doesn't really share us much about what's going on beyond that. He seems to sort of be trapped in this room. He's not sure how he got there. There's very little specificity around the interactions that occur with these other, unnamed characters, the they that he mentions at the beginning. And that is the type of unanswered question that exists across that whole first part. In addition to the sort of probing, this questioning that exists out into the ether, the style is very unconventional because the entire first part is this one long continuous paragraph. Now it's not one sentence. It's very clearly broken up into discrete sentences, discrete thoughts. So it's very different from something like Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. But it is this one long paragraph that runs for 100 pages. And in it we follow Molloy's meanderings. These meanderings around his identity, around his memory. He seems to not have the capabilities he once had, both physical and perhaps mental in terms of his memory. His mother's gone. There's mention at the very beginning of his son, but that's almost the only mention that exists of this son. And so it's a very strange narration that, again, veers at times into very comical interludes. We have this whole passage where he's trying to figure out, well, I like to suck on, rocks. And I want to make sure that, I have a couple of rocks to rotate through. And how would I do this? And he thinks about the different ways he could take 16 rocks and divide them up among the 4 pockets he has in his coat and shirt, and then make sure that he's cycling through the rocks. And it's strange. It is utterly pointless. It feels pointless. And yet Beckett's style manages to make it interesting, manages to give it this comedy that underlies these sort of quotidian experiences. But there are other moments that cut through a little more deeply and with a little bit more lucid passion, where we have statements like this. For to know nothing is nothing, not to want to know anything likewise, but to be beyond knowing anything, to know you are beyond knowing anything, that is when peace enters in, to the soul of the incurious seeker. And so with Molloy's sort of quest for his memory, quest for his mother who seems to be gone, quest for some type of answer around what's been going on, the quest that the reader has through this portion, we begin to realize that Molloy is perhaps an incurious seeker. And we begin to wonder, what is it that Beckett wants us as readers to be curious about within the book? But again, it can feel very dense among all of that comedy. This is a book that some folks, readers would say, I would absolutely love it, and others would say, 8 pages in, I'm done. I'm never touching it again. They're going to take the title of Beckett's famous play, Endgame, literally, and just stop reading him. But we do pursue through those 100 pages, and we have Molloy sort of end up almost lost in a forest. He's the incurious seeker who's gone off on this quest, and he's just ended up lost, as incurious seekers are perhaps want to. And we then enter our second narrator, Sergeant Moran. Sergeant Moran is a very different voice. It's amazing how different the voices are. It is midnight. The rain is beating on the windows. I am calm. All is sleeping. Nevertheless, I get up and go to my desk. I can't sleep. My lamp sheds a soft and steady light. I have trimmed it. It will last till morning. I hear the eagle owl. What a terrible battle cry. Once I listened to it unmoved. My son is sleeping. Let him sleep. The night will come when he too, unable to sleep, will get up and go to his desk. I shall be forgotten. My report will be long. Perhaps I shall not finish it. My name is Moran. Jacques. That is the name I am known by. I am done for. My son too, all unsuspecting. He goes on. That paragraph ends with, this cannot lead to confusion. Those first 2 paragraphs have utterly befuddled and confused us as we enter this new narration. Again, it's first person. This seems to be some report that Moran is writing and narrating. Again, we will begin to question how reliable he is, just as Molloy has been unreliable. And so we now enter into this new character who is very different, who does have a live son, Jacques Jr., who we will meet, who has a maid, Martha, and we'll see his interactions with them. We'll see his interactions with 2 other characters who do get names, unlike in Molloy in the first part where there were no names given. And so the duality exists between Molloy and Moran. And the little contrasts that are drawn and the parallels that are drawn are fascinating. Molloy will remember a man with clubs, a man with a club. Moran will see someone like that. There's the parallel around the sun. Molloy has various, physical ailments where he refers to using crutches. Moran gradually is going to develop a pain in his knee that ultimately leads to him using his umbrella that he's been carrying on this search for Molloy as his crutch. And so the parallels exist. And I think there's a sense where readers can draw this sense that perhaps Moran and Molloy are the same individual, or that Moran, through his writing of the report, is creating Molloy. That he, having been given this responsibility to go find Molloy, is in a sense going to create Molloy in order to find him, or to create Molloy perhaps in order to find himself. And so those possibilities exist. And we get within this second part what is, I think, perhaps sort of the credo that will be Beckett's sort of motto throughout the rest of his career. Because Moran says this, he goes, anger led me sometimes to slight excesses of language. I could not regret them. It seemed to me that all language was an excess of language. And the minimalism that Beckett is famous for, and the terse minimalism that he's famous for, I think is embodied in that line, that if we're using language to try and reflect an idea, or to try and reflect that that quest that we have as incurious seekers, or that Beckett perhaps has, if we're trying to use language to reflect life and try to build our castle, and build a universe out of language, it's an excess of language. And that perhaps language cannot be used ultimately to recreate life, but only to approximate an idea or approximate life. And so I found that sentence sort of buried within the book to be very fascinating, this concept of the excess of language. But with Moran, I do think there's the idea that perhaps Moran and Molloy are the same character, but I found a different interpretation of Moran as well. And I wanted to touch on that one. But before I do that, there's a beautiful callback to what I regard as sort of Beckett's callback to Joyce. So Beckett was deeply influenced by James Joyce. I think there's an idea that he viewed Joyce as the excess of language, and so he was going to swing the pendulum to the other side, and he wasn't going to recreate Finnegan's Wake. But within Molloy, he buries this one callback. If you recall, the first statement there was, it is midnight, the rain is beating on the windows, I am calm. Those are the first 3 sentences. He ends part 2, Moran, having sat down, is going to try and write out that report. But in the end, I understood this language. I understood it. I understand it. All wrong, perhaps. That is not what matters. It told me to write the report. Does this mean I am freer now than I was? I do not know. I shall learn. Then I went back into the house and wrote. It is midnight. The rain is beating on the windows. So we have that Finnegan's Wake style where the first sentence and the last sentence link up. So it goes, then I went back into the house and wrote, it is midnight. The rain is beating on the windows. It was not midnight. It was not raining. And I think there's our final sort of Beckett homage to Joyce, but also Beckett laughing and having a little bit of play and fun with Joyce. So that's part of what makes Molloy, I think, rewarding, are the little Easter eggs that exist within it. Now, in terms of sort of my own personal theory, I've yet perhaps to convince anyone of this idea, but I think that Moran, on some level, is not just representing Molloy, but is reflecting Beckett's own perception of who he regards God as within sort of that point in his life. And so Beckett had been raised in Ireland, but raised within the Church of Ireland, the Anglican Church of Ireland. And so his sort of Protestant conception of God is a little different from what we would see with James Joyce and his more Irish Catholic conception of God, that they were each raised in within their faith traditions. I think there are interesting ways in which Moran is characterized specifically as a father, and I think in some ways is emblematic of Beckett's conception of this God the Father that he had encountered from his childhood, and that he had, been read about within the Bible or experienced in church. And there are ways in which Moran, as a father, embodies these very negative characteristics that particular readings of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible might encounter. He makes these arbitrary demands on his son and on his housekeeper Martha. He won't tell them everything, and then he will suspect things. And for example, he tells his son, "You can take your sort of secondary stamp album on this trip we're going to go on, but not the nice one." And then he goes back in and he demands to know, let me see your second one. And I found these stamps that you just got that belong in your nice one. So we're just going to lock them both away. And I'm going to lock them both away right now. And then he thinks to himself, I'm going to lock these stamp albums away that I'm forbidding him to have, because I'm going to do it right now because I don't want to tempt him. He wouldn't be able to handle it. And he makes comments on himself as a father, and on himself with his housekeeper Martha, in which he recognizes that he is being arbitrary and still just feels that that's his role, that he has that authority. And there are statements about, there's something about a father that discourages derision, while of course this entire narrative that Moran has been composing encourages at best derision, if not outright, condemnation and scorn for who he is as a father. And so I think there's this very negative, dark perception of a God the Father that Beckett is creating here. Whether that's intentional or not, I read it in that existence. The way that he gradually develops this ability where he can't bend his knee. And I think that serves as a metaphor perhaps for how within his philosophy, within his existence, Moran doesn't bend as a person. He's inflexible in all these aspects of his life. And then the knee and its inability to bend becomes sort of this microcosm of who he is as an individual. So that was my own personal interpretation. But I'd be curious to know, do others have other interpretations on Molloy? I think there's plenty one could draw from this work. I'd be curious to know who else has read this. I do plan to read Malone Dies, probably in the near future. I think I'll sort of break my tradition of trying to always, read one book at most from an author each year. But I might keep working through this because it was interesting. I'm not always the greatest fan of Samuel Beckett. I've read Waiting for Godot. I'm still waiting for Godot to be a little bit funnier, perhaps more interesting. But I think the contrast between Beckett's drama and his novels does allow one to, I think, appreciate each a little bit more and see a different side of perhaps where he's going. In terms of other works, I was reminded of course, James Joyce. I was reminded to a certain degree of The Seventh Seal from Ingmar Bergman. That concept around God's silence, that existentialism, sort of an agnostic existentialism, the idea of the quest and sort of the failing quester, Molloy seems to end up lost in a forest. Moran doesn't ever find Molloy and then sits down to write a narrative that we are told in the final lines is a lie, that it was not midnight, it was not raining, and yet he's writing these things out. And so there are those aspects around it that reminded me of The Seventh Seal. I was also reminded of aspects of Joyce as a Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I was certainly reminded very deeply of Paul Auster's New York Trilogy. If you enjoy Samuel Beckett's writing, I highly recommend reading the New York Trilogy. If you dislike Samuel Beckett, please steer clear of Paul Auster's New York Trilogy. I don't think you'll enjoy it. And then it sounds like certain aspects of Beckett's, prose as a novelist and the themes he wants to explore sound a little bit like what Thomas Bernhard was creating. And so I'll be excited to read my first Thomas Bernhard work and see if there are more parallels that I can explore more deeply. But I did enjoy this. I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it as sort of my first read at the end of the school year. But again, I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks.